Chapter 6. Glacian knew Yawgmoth lied. He'd known from the first moment he had met the man. This is a charlatan and a monster, he had told himself. Yawgmoth's latest lie was the most outlandish of all. To think the very basis of THRAN ascendance was rotting the people who created it. To think that the foundations of the empire were so cracked and caving. And to base it all on eugenicist theory, that humans were mere animals, that they were animated by fluids and little beasties, that every tissue was made up of smaller tissues, every organism of smaller organisms in an infinite regression. It was all ludicrous. Glacian knew it. Rebek did not. Even as Yawgmoth burned the boy and stormed out the door, he had Rebek's ear. With that ear, he would gain the ear of all Halcyon. Glacian tried to warn his wife. Once the monster was gone, though, she heard only the screams of the boy. She had a fragile heart. She was a glass dove in her glass temple. The boy a worse faker than Yawgmoth. His blackened sternum was nothing next to Glacian's lesions. Did Rebek crouch over her own husband in worry? Did she touch his bare skin the way she had touched the boy's to lift that killing stone from him, Heathis carrying untouchable? Did she pay Glacian any mind? No. Glacian did not exaggerate his ills. He complained only a tenth of the woes he suffered, unlike this upstaging brat. He's not that hurt. Glacian growled at last. Shut up, she had said desperately. On cue, the faker stopped his struggling and fell into a seeming swoon. It was all quite touching. Rebek clung to him as healers came in to make the lad as comfortable as possible. They called it coma. Glacian called it an act. Did they listen? Of course not. Glacian was only a genius, and this lad only a scurvy rat who would chew off his own leg to get out of a trap. Who would they believe but the rat? Rebek lingered after the others were gone. She did her level best to assure her husband. He did his level best to convince her Yawgmoth was a lying monster and the boy a faker and killer. She did not hear, she could not. Rebek was incapable of perceiving the darkness of humanity. She had no word for it. She could look right through a monster and never see him at all. When she left that night, Glacian contented himself with a thought experiment. Thinking was his only refuge. Just now, he thought of power stone dynamics. It was well established that crystals were charged when their cores were bombarded with enough radiance that the matter within turned to energy. Now Glacian wondered what happened to the space occupied by those particles. In theory, matter existed only due to a compacting of space. Crumpled space trapped energy, slowing it into material form. Smooth space was like a sheet of paper in the rain, bombarded by water but gathering little of it. As the rain continues, though, the paper warps and gathers more rain. Rills rise and troughs deepen. Were the paper bombarded long enough, it would crumple and fold, trapping the water. So too, energy bombarded and warped space. The crumpled space trapped energy, converting it to matter. If so, when matter within a crystal was converted to energy, the space would unfold and straighten. Thus, charging a power stone unfolded even created space. Perhaps every charged power stone contained not only a vast store of energy but a vast area, a pocket dimension. This thought experiment occupied Glacian's mind during his convalescence. Once his strength had returned, he would perform true experiments to prove it all. Then Halcyon would know their genius had returned. Glacian would win back their ears. Such were Glacian's thoughts as he dropped into slumber. Such were his thoughts later. Yes, he was more brilliant in his sleep than others were waking when the hands clamped his throat closed. Suffocating, Glacian awoke to see that, once again, he had been the only one who saw the truth. Jix sat astride him. The boy. It occurred to Glacian only then that this gaunt figure was really more a man than a boy. Pinned his arms beneath Tedic knees and strangled him. Jix's pallid face was red. When Glacian opened his eyes and met the young man's gaze, the determination there stumbled. Jix must have glimpsed the true horror of his deed. The loss of Glacian would be not only to the citizens but also to the rats that ate what fell from the citizens' table. Hands tight around Glacian's throat, Jix began to speak. You did this to us. I used to think I had infected you, but you are the one who infected us both. You infected thousands in the caves. Each time he said the word infected, spittle leapt from his lips. That's reason enough to kill you. Glacian had no air to form words, but his lips silently spoke them, to murder me. It's not murder. It's justice. Kill me, and you'll die. Glacian's response was little more than moving lips and a bit of whispered air. Nostrils flaring in distaste, Jix eased his grip, allowing Glacian to suck a breath into his lungs. It was a moment of triumph for Glacian. This one pretended to be a hero, but he had no resolve. When his own life was the issue, he would make any deal to save himself. Glacian had a damnable gift for seeing into the minds of lesser men, and every man he had met was lesser. Now, Glacian used the one lie that would save him. The lie of Yawgmoth. He rasped, "Spare me, and Yawgmoth will spare you. Without Yawgmoth, you two are dead." Jix's eyes narrowed still more. I don't need to kill you. It would only be a mercy. You and I both will die. Yawgmoth can't save us. This much impressed Glacian. Maybe this boy, this man, did glimpse the truth. But better that you die in slow agony as I do, as my people do. Better that you live long enough to see us rise from the caves and kill your people and destroy your white haven. With that, Jix released Glacian and climbed off of him. Even so, the untouchable held a clenched fist above his foe's face. Raise the alarm, and I'll kill you just for spite. With satisfaction, Glacian noted the stitched scars and blackened lesions across the young man's body. You'll never get out of the city alive. You'll never reach your caves. I know ways down, Jix said ominously, and I know ways back up. He bolted for the door. Of course, Glacian raised the alarm. With his wrenched throat and weak lungs, he could do little more than mewl like a kitten. No one could hear him. The folk of Halcyon had stopped listening. Another man was stealing their ears. Rebek had not designed the council hall, and it was obvious. Massive, grim, grey, stodgy, symmetrical, fetid, for a century, this structure had been the height of Halcyon. It sat like a great cap atop a volcano. While all the other buildings of the city yearned toward it, this building presided over them with stout arrogance. It yearned toward nothing but itself. It was a shrine to the past. 8 massive drums held aloft the central octagon of the meeting space, which in turn shouldered the weight of the grey stone dome that shut out the light of heaven. As Yawgmoth stood beside Rebek just beneath that dome, he reminded himself that she had pluckily added a spiral stair and spire to it. Just as pluckily, she argued now with the Elder Council. Beneath each transept of the octagon sat a body of elders from one of the 8 THRAN city-states. The largest, Halcyon and Nuren, had 50 elders each and the others fewer. At the head of each group stood an exalted podium where the eldest of each city-state presided. At the center of the dome stood the highest podium of all, a platform reached by 2 opposite sets of stairs. Clustered beneath the central podium were the leaders' heads of clans, seers, and geniuses. Glacian would normally have been seated among those 20, but for his thesis. Glacian and his thesis were the business of the day. I completely disagree, Rebek replied to an eldest's objection. This is not a Halcyon concern alone. The work of my husband of Glacian is studied by every artificer in the land. The devices that have most greatly elevated us are his. Power stone use was innovated by him, but even that is not the issue. The issue is that each of our city-states is utterly dependent on power stone technology. Our cities will collapse sometimes literally if that technology is removed. The grey-robed and masked moderator called upon the eldest of Lausanne, a stately woman, half a head taller than most men and as thin as a statue. There is no evidence of this phthisis affecting anyone except your husband and the prison hordes in the caves. Indeed, your husband's ailment came from the caves, not from the city. Why not simply double the guard at the caves to prevent any escape and suspend visiting rights until this plague has run its course? Rebek was poised to respond, but Yawgmoth spoke instead. On the contrary, I have seen this plague in 3 other cities en route to here and have heard of it in the other 4. But always among the rabble, interrupted the eldest of Lozanon. Always among the poor indigent. No, Yawgmoth broke in. There is evidence of infection among the citizenry of Halcyon, among folk who have had no contact with untouchables. I have charted the progress of this plague in the caves of the damned and know the beginning signs of it. I have found 6 other cases in the city itself and I have not conducted an extensive search. In fact, I would speculate that among the nearly 400 of us gathered here, 10 are infected and do not even know it. That caused a sensation. The moderator stood from his chair, the symbol for silence. At the doors, the moderator's enforcers tensed, ready to pluck from the crowd any who would not fall to silence. Quiet resumed. The moderator sat and indicated another speaker, the eldest of Shinyan. The man was portly and privileged, accustomed to gaining his way outside of the council hall by diverting issues that might arise. These reports are alarming, surely, perhaps alarmist. You are one man, Yawgmoth. 3 years ago, you were a banished man among lepers, an enemy of the state. You practice a brand of healing that repels most of us. Why should we listen to you? Why should we take your word? Why should we believe you have ceased to be our enemy and become our friend? Don't take my word, Yawgmoth replied, shaking his head. I want you to find out for yourself. I'm asking for a core of your brightest minds to gather and see what I have found. They can judge for themselves. I'm asking for the chance to prove to you the reality and threat of this disease. Those who think me a charlatan can report their findings to this body. On the other hand, those who are convinced by my findings, my methods, could join me in searching for a cure. The eldest of Nuren was granted the floor. In your written proposal, you asked for more than a corps of observers. You asked for facilities, for equipment, for the right to screen citizens. Without such things, how am I to prove the reality of this plague? Yawgmoth pleaded in exasperation. He flung his hands out. Perhaps Rebek was too quick to say this was an issue of public health rather than the health of one man. But I would think, after all that Glacian has done for this empire, that it would supply a single wing of a single infirmary in which a small group of earnest seekers could do everything in their power to find a cure for him. Even if you will not allot the space and money to save yourselves, won't you allot it to save Glacian? The moderator recognized Jamoth, eldest of Halcyon. The woman stood. She was a regal figure in red, with high cheekbones and rheumy eyes. Jamoth opened an envelope and patiently unfolded a note within. Since you mention Leader Glacian, I feel it is time to read this. I received it by messenger this morning. It has Glacian's seal. He asked me to read this message to the assembled council. Friends. From my sickbed, dare I not call it my deathbed, I write this urgent request and warning. Shun the man Yawgmoth. He was once rightly declared an enemy of the state and exiled as such. I plead that he be exiled once more. I have been under his scalpel and his supposed ministrations for too long, have endured excruciating programs, and have watched my body decay more rapidly from Yawgmoth than from phthisis. He is a charlatan at best and at worst a monster. I did not wish his return, nor do I condone that he remain among us. Unless he is exiled, I am confident he will bring us again to civil war. If he is, as my wife supposes, my only hope, then I am consigned to die. I would rather die than live any longer as a prisoner to his violent manipulations. Therefore, I propose that the council vote immediately to banish the man Yawgmoth, declaring him now and forever an enemy of the THRAN Empire. Glacian of Halcyon. No sooner had the final word emerged from Jamatha's mouth, than in other mouths came shouts of approval, seconding the motion. Yawgmoth looked grimly at Rebek, but she clutched his hand. Her strength seemed to flow across to him. The moderator stood once again and said, I cannot allow a vote on this proposal when Yawgmotha's own proposal remains to be considered. I suggest the two be combined, Yawgmoth said suddenly. If I am not granted the facilities and assistance and provisions I requested in my proposal, I will leave this city. I will leave this empire. I might as well be banished. If you vote that you do not believe in my work, I will leave you to this thesis, which you also do not believe in. My friends, it will bring you to civil war, not I. Civil war and utter annihilation. Disbelieve Yawgmoth to your loss. Disbelieve the thesis to your peril. I suggest these two motions be combined into a single proposal. Those in favor of Glacian's terms for my banishment shall vote yea, and those in favor of my terms for continued research shall vote nay. Many calls came to second that motion. Then it has come to a vote, said the moderator. All those who favor Glacian's call for the immediate banishment of this man Yawgmoth, speak aye. The response was sullen and immediate. It echoed in the dome above as though the stolid building itself had spoken. Yawgmoth gripped Rebek's hands, sending back to her the confidence she had granted him. All those opposed to banishment and in favor of Yawgmotha's request for facilities, personnel, supplies, and so forth to continue his study, let them say nay. The sound was almost identical, though perhaps a bit louder if only for the resolve in the voices of those who spoke. In the opinion of the moderator, the motion for banishment carries. Calls came for a hand count, and the moderator granted it. Each of the eldest of the cities turned to face his contingents, conducting the same vote with a show of hands. Though Yawgmoth continued to cling to Rebek, his attention was elsewhere. He hawkishly watched the Halcide contingent. He observed those who voted for banishment. Every face was imprinted upon the black back of his mind. They won't do it, Rebek whispered to him. They won't condemn us. Yawgmoth glanced down at her. Do you mean they won't condemn you and Glacian, or you and me? Her eyes were querulous, almost hurt. To condemn you would be to condemn Glacian. Yawgmoth only nodded. His jaw muscles flexed beneath a sheen of black stubble. The counts were tallied, the totals taken to the moderator. She stood and announced, the healer Yawgmoth will have his facilities and observers. The 8 eldest shall see to it. Rebek was at home here now. It was midnight. The moon was a grand sickle that scratched along the crystal foundation. Power stones loomed now in starry rings all around. Light chased the myriad facets and rose in icy ghosts of doom. She was home here now. Glacian's illness was horrible. He was her soulmate. Together artifice and art they had transformed the empire. When he fell ill, she ached for him but did not fear for him. She had felt somehow that she, by mere exertion of will, could keep him alive, could bring him healing. It seemed impossible for him to die while she lived. Now, no doom was impossible. The specters of the future had risen from artifice and art. If the THRAN continued in the way pioneered by Glacian and Rebek, they were doomed to die. If they abandoned that way, they could only descend through the icy umbra of the heights they had once ascended. This place, loftiest structure in the empire, it was the utter embodiment of a hope for heaven that led inexorably to hell. Even as it hung here, it poisoned the people. Even as it gave them visions glorious throughout the days, it terrified their nights with relentless death. Rebek was at home here now. She was at home among the ghosts. She hoped, even, to catch the Thysis that ravaged her love and her land. Then she would be one with them. In all her ascending, she'd left them behind. Only Yawgmoth could save them now. Only Yawgmoth and his mad medicine. The climb down had been hard. The climb back up was sheer agony. Jix's body had weakened with each moment since he had released Glacian. Part of it was the Thysis, Of course. The black infection in his sternum had festered. Part of it, the larger part, was a niggling fear. Was survival more important to him than principle? Perhaps Jix had spared Glacian only because killing the man would mean his own death. He hated that thought. It wasn't true, it couldn't be true. It wouldn't be true once this raid was over. The Halcydes would pay for what they had done. Glacian would pay. When hosts of the damned flooded up through the sewers to drag them down in their own offal, the Halcydes would begin to understand their crimes. When untouchables drove them to their knees and made them kiss the suppurating wounds on their knuckles, the citizens would know their guilt. When garbage people leapt atop them and stomped on their backs, the Halcydes would never forget. Only thoughts like these made the wretched climb possible. Jix's body was racked with pain. When he had descended to the caves of the damned, he had been alone, driven downward by the news he bore to his people. Now as he climbed, he dragged hundreds of others up with him. At least this time, the awful news he carried was meant not for the damned but for the demons themselves.